All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Clumsy Clairvoyance. This is a chill stream tonight. Oops. Why do I hear myself in the background? Holy cow. Use my cell phone. Oopsie. Lakers. Boomer moment. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. Either way, I really do appreciate you being here. Let me say this. Let's get this out in the open first. This is a chill stream, so those of you that do come in here for your readings, I appreciate you so much. But this is not the reading stream. This is the nighttime stream. This is a chill stream. So, having said that, Maddie's already barking at me. Let's get it on. Let's do this. You take it forever. So, let me know if I'm sharing. No housekeeping. There is no housekeeping to really take care of at this moment, except for please like and subscribe. I would totally appreciate that. Totally. And if any of the mods drop links, please sub up to those channels. I really do want everyone supporting one another. So, and if you happen to have a channel, you want one of the mods to shill for you, as Maddie would say, please let them know. They will hook it up. Arf, arf! I see Mr. Malloy's barking at me. Arf, arf! Arf, arf, arf! And I was already talking to a few of you before we even went live. And Angel, it's so good to see you in here. Angel was on Mr. Malloy's last night. Angel is such a lovey, such a sweetheart. Sub up to his channel. He does, I think he's from what I remember, like a freelance like interviewer or media person. I've tried it. What's the term I'm thinking of? Someone help me. I only have half a brain tonight anyway. Mel, arf, 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 Mel, arf, 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 arf. Mel, Mel's driving. We will talk to her when she gets home. And Frog, thank you for the shout out. Frog gave me a shout out earlier on his live. I was in his live most of it, and at the moment he gives me a shout out. Of course, I'm not in there, but I did have a private reading I was doing. So I'm off the hook. Just kidding. No, but really, I was doing a private reading. If you guys aren't subbed up to Frog, please do so. But we were talking in regards to the full moon, the blue or the super blue moon that's going to be happening this month in 2 days. That's it, only 2 days. I am going to be covering it. There's a few different things that I am kind of, yes, Crystal, it was reporter. Thank you. Well, I don't know why I couldn't think of that word. It's so simple. But anywho, there is a few different things I am doing on my channel. I just don't know like what I'm doing exactly and how I'm going to organize it. But I will be doing something specifically for the special blue moon. So just, keep your eyes peeled and check that community tab. And if you are in Discord, you'll probably hear about it first. Look at Angel showing Mr. Malloy some love. And Crystal, thank you for being here. This is Angel's channel, y'all. Go sub up to him. Okay, so I was number 290 of his subscribers yesterday. So hopefully he's got more. I'm hoping so. Ash, good to see you. Jariah, of course. Misfit, have you had any? I can't even see what that is. Have you had any what in your meat? Oh, wait, no, hold on. Misfit, how can you have any blank if you don't eat meat? I'm confused. Misfit eats meat. He's full of crap. Don't listen to him. He eats meat. I've seen it with my own eyes. Lady V, so good to see you. Thank you for this. Yes, please like and subscribe. I would totally appreciate that. Okay, guys, so we are like I'm hoping Phyllis gets in here because, you know, Phyllis loves these chill streams. This is like her thing. It really is. Jen with no filter. So good to see you. Suzanne. Thank you. Yes, just up to Angel. Look, there you go. There you go, Angel. You got another sub. Whoop, whoop. Snuffy, I made it just in time. Well, Snuffy8733, please make sure you do subscribe. I would appreciate that sub. Jiraiya, you're too nice. What do I say? And it's so good to see you, Judy. Judy is such a lovely, such a warm-hearted, beautiful soul. Hold on. The super moon Wednesday will not happen until 2037. You mean it's not going to happen? Yep. Not going to happen again until 2037. Woo! That's a good fact to know. Thank you for that. I knew it'd be a while. I didn't know it'd be that long. Ash, you're such a lovey. Your naughty self. You know I love you, Ash. Dry Clumsy doesn't know her Pink Floyd. I'm not, you know what? I gotta admit, there's only like I'm not the hugest fan of Pink Floyd. They're okay. I'm not the hugest fan though. Okay, so y'all ready to do this? Scary, interesting. I think we might even have 2 to watch from Scary, Interesting tonight. Whoop, whoop. We're going to start with the best, though, because this one, I mean, I've been holding on to my panties. I can't do it any longer. They're going to have to drop because I'm so excited for this video. This one looks really, really good. So those of you who have never been to a chill stream, in particular, if you haven't been to a chill stream with where we're doing the Scary, Interesting, like kind of, you know, reactions, etc. Scary, Interesting. I'm going to drop his link actually right now. Let me drop his link. And any of the mods that are in here, make sure you just kind of maybe like shill this link every now and then in the chat. If you're not subbed up to Scary, Interesting, he is beyond worth a sub. His name's Sean. That's right. Sean from Scary, Interesting. He does really, really good work. I just dropped the link. I don't think there's been a video he does. He does a lot of cave stuff too. I'm not so much into the cave stuff. I do watch some of it. But his main source or like his main videos that he does with the like horrible fates, and then he just started a new one about like weird disappearances or strange disappearances. He does such a good job, but this new one looks just in particular so cool. So, but anyway, if you haven't been here for a chill stream, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry like you're like coming in like in the middle of a chapter, you know, in the middle of a story or a book, etc. We're gonna start this video from the beginning to the end. It's not like you have to have any backstory whatsoever. So having said that, give me a thumbs up and we'll get rolling. I'm gonna make myself small so I can make this bigger. So hold on one moment. Crystal Clear, do you have a channel? Can one of my mods drop her link? Watch, probably Maddie already did it. Let's see, he just thank you. You stopped frog. Misfit can probably do this. I know Belle's busy, or Ash. Can one of you drop Crystal's link if she has a channel? I feel like she does. Am I doing cards later? No, I am not. I am not doing cards later, Mr. Moy. I'm taking a break from cards just for tonight. Unless there's like a specific question you have, you can hit me up in the DMs and Discord. I will totally pull some cards for you. But I didn't feel like doing a live like with the readings tonight. I just didn't feel like it. I wanted to do the chill stream. So, having said that, let's roll. So make me less big. Thank you, Ash. You're awesome. Appreciate that, love. Okay, so tell me real quick, guys, if you could hear and see everything, okay? Just give me a thumbs up. I'm just going to play just a few seconds real fast. Again, yes, y'all, sub up to Crystal Clear, sub up to Frog, anyone who has a channel, Angel, whomever, if one of the mods drops the link, please support one another. I really do appreciate that. Michael, you are the best, always a friend forever. Aw, sweet. Okay, so after this, I will go live for the after party after you're finished. Okay, yeah, it won't be that long. It'll probably be about an hour, so you'll have an early after party. This bumps on the headphones. Okay, so that's a thumbs up. Awesome. That means you guys can hear perfectly. Okay, so we are ready to go. I'm so excited for this one, y'all. I'm so excited. All right, let's roll.
Fate is defined as the development of events beyond a person's control. So in this video, we're going to look at 3 stories of people who were powerless to their circumstances. I have to warn you, these stories are as frustrating as they are horrifying and tragic. As always, viewer discretion is advised. One of the worst things a mother can do is watch her son die. When it happens, it can be like a whirlwind. An army of people surrounds you, asking you to sign forms, asking questions, offering advice, and pushing you to make decisions that you don't want to make. All you want to do is grieve, but you can't. When Judy's 20-year-old son William passed away on May 2nd, 2004, she found herself in that situation. Most of it was just noise, and when there wasn't noise, there was too much silence. But from among all that chaos came a request to use William's organs for transplant. She knew William had wanted this, and he had mentioned it a few times, but honestly, she was surprised they'd even consider him. William had been unemployed and living with her in a small, musty apartment, and he'd spent much of his short adult life in prison or high. She knew he'd been smoking marijuana and suspected he might be using harder substances as well. He wasn't a bad kid, just one who made bad decisions. He wanted to do better, he just didn't get the chance. A week prior to his death, on April 28th, she'd taken him to the emergency room because he had a bad headache and kept vomiting uncontrollably. The pain was apparently so bad that he wasn't being himself and he was acting out and losing his temper, and she desperately wanted to get him some help. He also had a bit of a fever that she wanted the doctors to look at, but tragically, on May 3rd, he suffered a brain hemorrhage and died. Because of his background and because of all the symptoms, they assumed it was caused by an overdose 7 days earlier. Between the prison visits and regular drug use, Judy had been told that he was at risk of HIV or hepatitis, but the once strict donation rules had been loosening as science improved. Organs don't have to be perfect or completely infection-free anymore, they just need to be good enough to do the job. So Judy decided that if she could use her son's death to save other people, she would. They quickly prepped William, flew in an expert to harvest his lungs, liver, kidneys, and sections of his arteries, and then shipped them to Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, where 5 patients were waiting for transplants. The medical staff assured Judy she'd made the right decision, and the surgical teams in Dallas got ready to give the families waiting on the transplant list the good news. For Joshua, William's death was supposed to be a second chance at life. Joshua was just 2 years old when his parents were told he had progressive kidney failure. By age 11, he'd been diagnosed with a disease that slows down kidney functions and stops them from filtering waste. By 18, he'd spent his whole life with swollen feet and ankles, fighting for breath when the other kids found things easy, and sometimes becoming so nauseous that he would have to dry heave, even though he hadn't eaten all day. The transplant was a new
Phyllis, you are late. Late, Phyllis. Late, and late. Only for you, and only you while I rewind it a little bit. But we just started, okay? So if you guys are mad, don't get mad at me, yell at Phyllis. Just kidding. But I don't want Phyllis to miss anything because she loves these shows. Like, she loves them. So,
unemployed and living with her in a small, musty apartment, and he spent much of his want to make. All you want to do is worst things a mother can do is watch her son die.
Don't be sorry, you're fine. It's only 2
One of the
minutes.
worst things a mother
Everyone,
can do
we'll all
is
live.
watch her son die. When it happens, it can be like a whirlwind. An army of people surrounds you, asking you to sign forms, asking questions, offering advice, and pushing you to make decisions that you don't want to make. All you want to do is grieve, but you can't. When Judy's 20-year-old son William passed away on May 2nd, 2004, she found herself in that situation. Most of it was just noise, and when there wasn't noise, there was too much silence. But from among all that chaos came a request to use William's organs for a transplant. She knew William had wanted this, and he had mentioned it a few times, but honestly, she was surprised they'd even consider him. William had been unemployed and living with her in a small, musty apartment, and he'd spent much of his short adult life in prison or high. She knew he'd been smoking marijuana and suspected he might be using harder substances as well. He wasn't a bad kid, just one who made bad decisions. He wanted to do better, he just didn't get the chance. A week prior to his death, on April 28th, she'd taken him to the emergency room because he had a bad headache and kept vomiting uncontrollably. The pain was apparently so bad that he wasn't being himself and he was acting out and losing his temper, and she desperately wanted to get him some help. He also had a bit of a fever that she wanted the doctors to look at, but tragically, on May 3rd, he suffered a brain hemorrhage and died. Because of his background and because of all the symptoms, they assumed it was caused by an overdose 7 days earlier. Between the prison visits and regular drug use, Judy had been told that he was at risk of HIV or hepatitis, but the once strict donation rules had been loosening as science improved. Organs don't have to be perfect or completely infection-free anymore. They just need to be good enough to do the job. So Judy decided that if she could use her son's death to save other people, she would. They quickly prepped William, flew in an expert to harvest his lungs, liver, kidneys, and sections of his arteries, and then shipped them to Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, where 5 patients were waiting for transplants. The medical staff assured Judy she'd made the right decision, and the surgical teams in Dallas got ready to give the families waiting on the transplant list the good news. For Joshua, William's death was supposed to be a second chance at life. Joshua was just 2 years old when his parents were told he had progressive kidney failure. By age 11, he'd been diagnosed with a disease that slows down kidney functions and stops them from filtering waste. By 18, he'd spent his whole life with swollen feet and ankles, fighting for breath when the other kids found things easy, and sometimes becoming so nauseous that he would have to dry heave, even though he hadn't eaten all day. The transplant was a new lease on life. After the operation and recovery, he graduated from high school and started driving a new truck that until then he'd only been fit enough to go out in 3 times. He'd also wanted to be a doctor and planned on attending college and becoming an echocardiologist. The future was seeming incredibly bright. A few weeks after his release from the hospital, though, things began to darken. For Joshua, William.
Hold on, I rewound just a tad because I lost what was going on with Joshua, so that's on me.
William's death was supposed to be a second chance at life. Joshua was just 2 years old when his parents were told he had progressive kidney failure. By age 11, he'd been diagnosed with a disease that slows down kidney functions and stops them from filtering waste. By 18, he'd spent his whole life with swollen feet and ankles, fighting for breath when the other kids found things easy, and sometimes becoming so nauseous that he would have to dry heave, even though he hadn't eaten all day. The transplant was a new lease on life. After the operation and recovery, he graduated from high school and started driving a new truck that until then he'd only been fit enough to go out in 3 times. He'd also wanted to be a doctor and planned on attending college and becoming an echocardiologist. The future was seeming incredibly bright. A few weeks after his release from the hospital, though, things began to darken. By early June, headaches that he tried to ignore became unbearable, and he kept breaking out in a sweat, followed by bouts of uncontrollable vomiting. Joshua's mother, Jennifer, initially put it down to the usual complications associated with the transplant, but then as her son's health worsened, she began to worry if maybe he'd got an infection while in surgery. Or maybe it was something worse. Despite all the care taken in matching organs with patients, sometimes the immune system can mistake something new for a threat and attack it. Maybe his body was rejecting the new kidney. So she took Joshua back to Baylor's emergency room where he was placed in intensive care, and weirdly, he wasn't on his own. Joshua and his mother were shocked and more than a little worried that 2 more patients with William's organs were already there. A woman named Sherry had also received a kidney from William, and like Joshua, she left the hospital feeling like she had a new lease on life. She'd spent a year on dialysis and was relieved to be off it. It was a new freedom, a solution to her problems, and for most of May that year, everything was great. Then, on May 20th, she started feeling nauseous and got a bad headache that she just couldn't get rid of, just like Joshua. Unfortunately, her symptoms worsened as soon as she was discharged on May 27th, and it became so unbearable that she was admitted back into the hospital on June 1st. Then another 52-year-old man named Jimmy, who'd received William's liver, had also been admitted with these same symptoms. They couldn't all be rejecting William's organs, it had to be something else. Weirdly too, all three had the exact same symptoms. Once the headaches and vomiting passed, they started to become confused or agitated, their throats became so sore that the idea of drinking terrified them, making it increasingly hard to sleep at night. Meanwhile, the staff at the hospital gave them whatever medication they could to try to make things easier. When all of the three of them were well enough, they'd talk and make jokes, trying to determine what was going wrong and actually becoming good friends in the process. Soon, though, the illness got past the medication. They hallucinated and became increasingly erratic, showing signs of extreme anxiety and paranoia. They also became sensitive to light and sound and began wandering around aimlessly, and they were even aggressive, sometimes trying to bite the people who came into their rooms. This was also accompanied by drooling non-stop. Then, tragically, on June 7th, Jimmy died, followed by Sherry on the 9th. At the same time, a man from North Texas who'd been given one of William's arteries during a liver transplant died the same way in another hospital. The fifth victim, a man who was supposed to be receiving William's lungs, died in surgery. Joshua's mom was also desperate to save her son, but it was just too late. Because he was younger and stronger, Joshua managed to hold out for a couple of weeks, but on June 21st, tragically, he too passed away. Following an autopsy, they found that 4 of the people given William's organs had contracted rabies. Rabies is a virus that quickly spreads to the brain of the host, and there's a vaccine for it, but there's no cure. So if you contract rabies without being vaccinated, it's a death sentence. Any mammal can get it, but worldwide, dog bites are the most common way it's spread. Bats have also been known to transmit it, especially in North America. So it was clear that it wasn't William's alleged drug use that had killed him. He'd been bitten while living in his mother's bat-infested apartment, and that bite had killed him and 5 others. The surgeons hadn't tested for it because it just never occurred to them. When William and his mother came in, nobody mentioned a bite. Everything about William's death suggested drugs, not rabies. Later, 29 members of the victims' families, 61 healthcare workers, and nearly a dozen others had to undergo a painful rabies injection and its side effects. In the end, the victims' families blamed the hospital, not Judy. Kind of horrifyingly too, rabies is so rare and testing for it is so expensive that surgeons aren't expected to warn anybody that a donor organ might be infected. Even today, not all organs are screened for rabies.
Whoa! Rabies? Holy crap. That was horrible and sad, and that poor mom, she probably felt horrible and guilty after. I just got chills all over. That poor lady. And rabies, what a freak accident. Or, like something that, I don't want to say freak accident, but how rare that would happen, like they were saying, that they don't even test for it because it's that rare that it would even be a chance that it could happen. Crazy. Okay, so here comes the second story, y'all. This is story number 2.
One of the most important days in a British person's life is their 18th birthday. It's not so much a celebration as it is a coming-of-age ceremony because it's a day that's finally legal to drink alcohol, and you test how much of it you can manage. It's even common for people to forget what they did on their 18th birthday in Britain. If they're being honest though, most people actually want to forget because they did some stupid things that day. But Gabby wants to forget for another reason. For her, it was the worst night of her life. Back in 2012, Gabby had ambitions to become an accountant and had started studying for her exams at St. Thomas Academy in Lancaster, England. Not long after second year began, she and 13 friends got together to plan her 18th birthday. It was another friend's 18th too, so they decided to join forces and go out to dinner. Afterward, they figured they might move from bar to bar, drinking cocktails and seeing where things led. Gabby told her parents what she wanted to do, and although they were worried, they knew she was a sensible girl and had a ride home. When Thursday came around, the 2 birthday girls and their friends met up in the center of town, and at 6:45 they headed to a wine and bistro bar where they booked a table to kick off the celebrations. They actually spent more time talking than drinking, and the night was initially relatively tame. But Gabby was enjoying herself and felt special with all the attention she was getting. Once they'd finished their meal, a party member suggested trying something different for her first legal drink. At the beginning of the 2010s, cocktails made from dry ice had become the latest gimmick, and celebrity chefs like Heston Blumenthal, known for creating weird creations with odd ingredients, used it to make desserts like egg and bacon ice cream. At the same time, bars were dropping it into cocktails to create a smoking effect. Dry ice is formed using liquid nitrogen. As a gas, nitrogen is safe, and even 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. To make it into a liquid, it needs to be cooled to minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 196 degrees Celsius. For the dry ice effect, you let the liquid evaporate at room temperature, which it does almost as soon as it meets air, leaving a safe but cold cocktail behind. Another trend of the 2010s was a drink called Jägermeister. This is a strong German liquor made from herbs and spices and has a sharp aniseed taste. People would have shots of it after finishing a pint of beer, or even put a shot glass of it in another drink as a Jaeger bomb. And it was inevitable that both trends would be brought together sooner or later. This new concoction was known as a Nitro Jägermeister. It was 1 part cold coffee, 1 part Jägermeister, and then a liquid nitrogen bomb was dropped in the middle. Gabby and the other birthday girl decided that their first legal drink would be one of these exciting new combinations, and a friend decided to join them. They watched as the mixologist poured the ingredients into a metal shaker and then shook it violently before pouring the mixture into 3 glasses. Gabby even remembers how theatrical it was when the server came over with 3 smoking green-brown cocktails, each topped with a crisp white foam, and how the table went silent as the drinks approached. Gabby wanted to check if drinking it was safe while some of the gas was still coming out, so she called the waiter back and he told her it was fine. Liquid nitrogen could be dangerous, but it should have all evaporated. She then sipped her cocktail and was a little disappointed. She wasn't a fan of aniseed, and the aniseed coffee mixture didn't do much for her. But it was her first legal alcoholic drink, and she was out to have some fun, so she went with the gimmick. The waiter seemed to spot Gabby's disappointment and, wanting to make it up to her, offered her another one on the house. She hesitated and then looked around at the faces of her expectant friends and politely accepted the offer. When it arrived, she took a swig from it, and straight away her stomach felt weird. She told the waiter, and he told her not to worry and that the cocktail could make you a bit gassy. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Her second drink still contained a little bit of liquid nitrogen, which can burn through almost anything. Right away, she started to feel sick, and she could feel a burning sensation in the pit of her stomach as it began to expand outward, and before long, she was doubled over in pain. When her friends asked what was wrong, she couldn't even talk. All she could do was scream in agony as the liquid nitrogen started to eat away at her stomach lining. Gabby was terrified, and her friends began to panic, and one of them grabbed her and dragged her towards the car, insisting that she drive Gabby to the hospital rather than wait for an ambulance. Then at 10 p.m., they arrived at the emergency room, and by then, Gabby couldn't even walk or communicate with anyone. The hospital staff got her into a wheelchair and took her straight through for a scan and found that she had a large gap in her stomach. She was then immediately taken to surgery to repair the hole. The procedure lasted for 4 hours, and horrifyingly, they discovered that the liquid nitrogen hadn't just torn a hole in her stomach, her entire stomach lining had been destroyed. All they could do to save her was remove her stomach completely and then take the tube responsible for getting food from the mouth to her bowels, the esophagus, and fasten it directly onto her bowels. Gabby's parents rushed to her bedside and were with her in the morning as soon as they could after surgery. They held her hand as she faded in and out of consciousness and listened to the doctors as they explained what they had done to keep her alive. It was the first time they'd removed a stomach on a non-cancer patient. When Gabby woke up, they explained it all to her, but she couldn't grasp what it all meant. She then spent 5 days in intensive care and another 3 weeks afterward in recovery. And in that time, the point where her esophagus was joined to her bowels formed into a small pouch that allowed her to digest food. The surgeons were worried for a while that their operation might not have worked and that they might have to go back in, but thankfully they did their job well, and further scans showed no leakage or any problems. Tragically though, Gabby will never feel hungry again or enjoy her food like before. Because of her condition, she can only eat bland liquid meals that she forces down because she has to. She also has to have daily vitamin injections because without a stomach, it's hard to get essential nutrients into her system. Incredibly though, it could have been worse. Initially, her doctors thought that she might have to be fed by a tube for the rest of her life. Understandably, Gabby was angry, and it didn't take long before the wine bar and bistro faced steep fines and a civil suit, which incidentally, they never paid. The police then also visited every other bar in Lancaster to warn them about what had happened, and most of them stopped using liquid nitrogen in their cocktails. Some cocktail waiters and mixologists still use liquid nitrogen in their creations today, but it's rare to find it used in the drink itself. Albert Stevens had been driving all day when he pulled up outside the University of California Hospital in San Francisco. He had had a surprisingly pleasant drive down through the hills of his hometown, despite how much pain he was in. The scenery actually distracted him a little bit from the agony he'd been experiencing in his stomach, and he was hoping the specialist could finally do something about it. His pain had quickly gone from a slight bother to so severe that he couldn't concentrate on anything else. It hurt so bad that it was even aging him. His hair was graying, and he was sure he could see more wrinkles on his face than before. He'd been dropping weight too, and when the family doctor saw him, he was told that he'd lost over 40 pounds in just a few months. Prior to all of this, and even still, Albert loved to drive. In the 1920s, he'd spent a year driving an old Model T covered in his belongings as he and his wife moved from Ohio to California. Back then, his wife was the sick one, and they were traveling cross-country to a warmer climate to try and help her asthma, and apart from the asthma, it was the best time of his life. After settling down, he set himself up as a house painter, and he was popular and always had work, and he became known for his smile and the quality of his work. Unfortunately, he hadn't smiled in quite some time, and he'd been finding it difficult to paint. In fact, none of the things he enjoyed were fun anymore. All he could do was think about his stomach pain. Initially, the family doctor suspected that he had a malignant ulcer that had spread to the liver, and he suggested he consult a specialist in the Bay Area. When Albert got to UC San Francisco, he checked in and was sent to see pathologist Dr. James F. Reinhardt. Albert was also worried about the cost, but the hospital assured him that he could bring that down by having his family come to the hospital to replace any blood he might need. They only needed a $30 deposit, or roughly $500 today, and then $5 a day from then on. The pathologist then tests him to find out what was wrong by checking his urine and performing an x-ray. They also asked his son to fill in some forms about the family's medical background. When the results came back, Dr. Reinhardt had to give them the bad news that Albert had stomach cancer and it was aggressive. They could try some surgery, but that wasn't guaranteed. And unfortunately, he was only given 6 months to live. Even back in 1945, 58 years old was a young age to die. Somehow, following this diagnosis, a research doctor named Dr. Joseph Gilbert Hamilton heard about Albert and wanted to offer him a deal. Hamilton was a radiology expert and wanted Albert to become part of a new experiment using radioactive phosphorus for a special study. If Albert agreed, they'd cover all his medical expenses, no matter how long he had to stay in the hospital. Albert signed up right away, hopeful that he might be able to help others, if not himself. Unbeknownst to Albert, though, Dr. Hamilton wasn't just a professor of experimental medicine and radiology at UC San Francisco. Interestingly, he also worked on the Manhattan Project. In case you aren't aware, the Manhattan Project was a top-secret research community run by Major General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. It was based out of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and its main goal was to develop the first atomic bomb. But that wasn't the only research that was going on there. Fairly early in the project, the staff had noticed that some of the materials people were handling were dangerous to their health. Little was known about the effects of radiation back then, other than that they knew that it could kill. Several scientists had even died of radiation poisoning over the years, but they didn't know much detail about how small doses affected people. Much of their research used radium or uranium, but a new material was proving more challenging to study. Back in 1941, chemists isolated a byproduct of uranium they called plutonium. It looked like it could be a better fuel for atom bombs than uranium, so they built a reactor to make it on an industrial scale for the Manhattan Project. In the early days, a lot of people handled plutonium and they were often surrounded by dust and other radioactive particles they could be breathing in. As a result, the medical team started trying to find out how much someone could accidentally ingest by wiping everyone's noses as they left the facilities. Unfortunately, the readings they were getting were higher than they liked, so the health director insisted on implementing a safety plan and asked for more studies into the impact of plutonium on the human body. Unfortunately, the problem is that it's hard to detect plutonium once it's ingested. Most radioactive materials like uranium and radium give off gamma rays that can penetrate solid objects like human cells. That makes it easy to measure them once they get outside the body. But plutonium mostly emits alpha particles, and they can't get through human tissue. They had to find a way to get plutonium inside people if they had any chance of studying it, so they figured the best way to do this was by injecting a human with a tiny amount of plutonium. Dr. Hamilton had been experimenting with radioactive materials since the 1930s. Even long before the Second World War had started, he'd been trying to find ways to use radiation to kill cancer cells. He even tested it on himself at one point, and unsurprisingly, he eventually died from his prolonged exposure to radiation in 1957. Hamilton was helpful to the Manhattan Project not only because he was a radiation expert, but also because of his research position at UC San Francisco. When human trials started, he was the perfect person to select patients. He wanted to use people whose prognosis was that they would die in a year or less. These were people who technically had no hope anyway. And Albert wasn't the first person Hamilton had experimented on. In total, Hamilton injected plutonium into 18 people, with ages ranging from 4 to 69. Nearly half of these people died within 2 years, and some of them almost straight away. Others lasted as long as 44 years from the experiment, and because he'd chosen terminally ill people, it was hard to know if the plutonium had killed them or their original illness. And unfortunately, they did not get consent from most of these patients. They thought it was essential that the patients didn't know what was happening for national security reasons. It's hard to overstate just how secret the Manhattan Project was. Even the hospital staff were kept in the dark. Like Albert, they were under the assumption that Dr. Hamilton's team was conducting studies into radioactive phosphorus. Other than that, the only thing they did know was that it was a secret and that Albert was only to be known as CAL-1. And under that assumption, and that he was being told the truth, Albert was ready to try anything that might slow his cancer. So on May 14th, he drove back to UC San Francisco. A member of Hamilton's team, a radiologist named Earl Miller, delivered the plutonium shot, and that single dose exposed Albert to nearly 60 times the amount of radiation recommended to radiation workers every year of their life. 4 days later, Albert was brought back into the hospital for surgery, and by then he was having trouble walking. After laying him on his side, they made a long incision underneath his ribs and found the enormous cancerous mass they expected. When they began operating, they found that the tumor had spread so widely that they had to remove most of his stomach, half his liver, his spleen, one of his ribs, a section of his pancreas, his lymph nodes, and an apron of fat that covered his internal organs. Earl then took samples for their experiments and sent the rest to the hospital pathologist. He also ordered the hospital to keep Albert's urine and stool samples for testing. Horrifyingly, when the pathologist finally checked a sample from Albert's stomach, he discovered it wasn't actually cancer. Albert only had a benign gastric ulcer that had become inflamed. They'd planned to check his cancer with a direct look using exploratory surgery, but they'd never done that. Albert's family also had a long history of cancer, so they were confident of their diagnosis and wanted to avoid the discomfort. If they had, Albert would have had a major but not as extensive surgery, and he never would have ended up in the plutonium program. The medical staff treating Albert couldn't believe it, and Earl was distraught. He spent days reviewing the results and re-examining the slides with Albert's tissue in it, desperate to find trace of cancer, but he couldn't. Luckily, neither the plutonium nor the unnecessary surgery killed Albert, and a month after being admitted, he was discharged to continue his recovery at home. He had to pop back into the hospital from time to time to give samples and have checkups due to complications, but he was generally well. A few months after his discharge, though, there was a problem. The surgery meant that Albert couldn't find work and was finding life in California a little too expensive. He then explained this to his doctors that he was considering moving, which wasn't good news for Hamilton's team. They had to find a way to make him stay, and they couldn't pay him as an experimental subject without explaining what they were doing, at least partly. They'd also told the hospital staff that the phosphorus study was a secret. They thought about paying him to go to a nursing home or adding him to Hamilton's payroll, but ultimately they decided to just pay Albert for urine and stool samples instead. Every day he had to do what he had to do, then he sealed them in containers and stored them in his shed. Once a week, a nurse would come by to collect it all, and this suited Albert just fine. He thought it was a lucky break just not having to pay his medical bills. Now they were even paying him after the fact too. And incredibly, no one ever told Albert or his family about the plutonium injection. They didn't even admit that he never had cancer until long after he died. Albert went on to live cancer-free until 1966 when he died of heart disease at 79 years old. Prior to his death, he returned to the hospital with complications from time to time, kept up with his routine tests, and provided a steady supply of urine and stool samples for people to study. The only complication due to the plutonium was found 10 years after the initial experiment. On one trip to the hospital, they found an area of bone at the top of his spine that had started to degenerate, and we now know that plutonium likes to settle into your bones and do its damage there. After his death, Albert was cremated and placed in a local chapel, and then in 1975, the American government took possession of his ashes and sent them to various research laboratories for further study, where they probably still rest to this day. Hello everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. I have some exciting news. In the near future, we're going to be starting a Scary Interesting podcast. This will feature brand new Scary Interesting content, similar to what you see here on YouTube, but in an audio-only format, wherever you listen to podcasts. The video portion
I told y'all that was going to be a good one. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to post Scary Interesting's link again. You guys sub up to him. I love like all of his stuff. I think we have one more to watch from him. Which story do you guys think was the craziest? Was it 1, 2, or 3? Which one did you think was just like wowzers? I'm curious. Jeez, leave Albert alone. I know, right? And welcome, Cova Cat. I've never seen you here before. Welcome. So hold please. I'm going to grab the other one we're going to watch. So one moment. Awesome, Phyllis. But Phyllis, you're not allowed to watch all the new episodes without me, okay? Just letting you know. And Lady V, have a good night. Love you. Get some good rest. That third one got you. I think the first one for me, I'd have to say number one was really like, wow. Good night, Bullfrog. Have a good one, Lovey. Thank you again. Crystal Blair said, I'll be contrary and go with 2. Jen with no filter, you almost had like a connection to each of these stories, huh? Lieutenant Dan, ice cream. At least 2 of them. That's so crazy. Okay, so let me know if I'm sharing. I'm going to press play just to make sure you guys can hear again, and then we'll get started. So this is, again, it's very interesting. I'll drop his link one more time.
In 1845, 2 ships entered the dark waters of the frozen and barren.
This one is the disturbing disappearance of the Franklin expedition. Ooh, this ought to be interesting. All right, everyone, give me a thumbs up if you guys can hear okay. And then then we shall begin. After this one, I think Mr. Malloy said there's going to be a chill stream over at his place. So, but we got one more left. By the way, you guys, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you have not. I would super duper appreciate it. You guys, give me a thumbs up if you can hear. Please. And thank you. I don't know, Maddie. Do we have a hot date or something I'm unaware of? Okay, so I think you go for cat. Ready? Let's roll.
In 1845, 2 ships entered the dark waters of the frozen and barren Canadian archipelago in search of an elusive Northwest Passage. At the large mouth of the channel, they were met by 2 whaling ships who saw them off shortly afterward. These would be the last individuals to see the ships or the men on board ever again. For over a century, their whereabouts remained a mystery, but slowly over the past few decades, what happened to these ships and the men on board has been discovered, and it is far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is Franklin's Lost Expedition. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Living in the mid-1800s must have felt similar to the digital boom of the 90s and 2000s or the post-war economy and tensions of the 1950s, because in just a few short decades, everything had changed. The Enlightenment and the end of the Napoleonic Wars had set a new way for much of the world. Steam engines had kick-started the Industrial Revolution, and for the first time in human history, we were close to having a map of the entire world. But to finish it, there was one final prize that eluded everyone who had tried. This was the Northwest Passage. At the time, England and many of the other world powers had been spreading their influence through trade and empire, but the shape of the Americas was a natural barrier to sea travel. Since the technology to create something like the Panama Canal wouldn't exist for some time, that meant that ships would either have to take the long way down around South America, then all the way back up the Pacific, or sail the other way around the globe. Either way, it was quite the journey. So the chance, however small, that a path might be found through the frozen Northwest Territories of Canada was too much for the British Admiralty to give up. And even if it did prove impossible for trade, the prestige of filling in the last navigable waterway on Earth was enough of a prize that some people devoted their entire careers to it. Like, for example, Sir John Barrow, second Secretary of the British Admiralty, aged 81 at the time, saw this as a chance to put one last grand feather in his cap before retirement. So he ordered a final expedition to be assembled and set out to choose its leader. Barrow's first two choices had both declined, one of which was William Parry, who had grown tired of the Arctic, and the wife of the other, James Ross, convinced him not to go. The third choice, Francis Crozier, was passed over by the Admiralty for being an Irishman and of low birth. Then the fourth choice, James Fitzjames, was seen as too young and inexperienced to lead such an undertaking. So finally, the fifth choice, and the man the expedition would be named for, was Sir John Franklin. This would actually be Franklin's third attempt to find the passage, having done so by sea and by land before with mixed success. His previous attempt had even led to the deaths of half his men, with the survivors resorting to eating moss and leather to avoid starvation. Afterward, Franklin returned in shame, known as the man who ate his boots. In spite of that, though, Franklin was well liked by his men, and he was known to be kind and cared for their well-being, sometimes leading them in sermons and going out of his way to ensure their safety. He was also known to be a little overly enthusiastic and had previously gotten carried away when a goal was in front of him, rushing to the finish rather than doing things carefully. But a combination of care for his men in a dangerous place and the enthusiasm to see it through to the end wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and thankfully, he wouldn't be doing it alone. Although they were deemed inadequate to lead the expedition, Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames would be joining Franklin as his second and third and would be the captains of two ships under Franklin's command called the Terror and the Erebus. For the ships, there would be no expense spared and no cutting-edge technology left out. The lead ship, the Erebus, was a Hecla-class bomb vessel commissioned in 1826 and 105 feet long. The Terror was a little older and smaller and was a Vesuvius-class bomb vessel from 1813 and 102 feet long. Both ships were chosen because bomb vessels were meant to fire heavy mortar from their decks, so they had extra cross bracing. That also allowed them to better withstand breaking through the ice in the north, but all of that was just standard. In addition to that, portions of the ship's wooden hulls had been doubled in thickness, with even more iron sheeting added to the bows and along the waterline for the expedition. Both ships also received vents for internal heating, as well as a brand new addition no ship in the Royal Navy had ever possessed before, which was a propeller. And not just that, both ships could even retract their propellers and rudders in recesses on the underside of their hulls to protect them from the ice. To power this newly added propeller, each ship carried a converted locomotive steam engine from the London and Greenwich Railway to drive the ships even in the absence of wind. These motors also required roughly a ton of fresh water per hour and spurred another invention to be included, which was desalination equipment to turn seawater into fresh water. The expedition would also bring with it one of the first types of photographic cameras ever to be sold to the public, called a daguerreotype camera. They also even had an insulated diving suit on board if ice ever needed to be removed from the rudders or propellers. These features are obviously commonplace today, and the Arctic is largely known about, but to the men actually going on the expedition, it might have felt like going to space. Only 6 of the expedition's 24 officers had been to the Arctic before, and to anyone seeing it for the first time, it might as well have been another planet. Compasses would shift and wander because of how close to the pole they were. Months could pass without the sun setting or rising. The entire ocean turns to solid most of the year, and the land is so barren that you will only ever see white snow, gray rocks, and dark blue waters. On the 19th of May, 1845, the Erebus and Terror set sail to Greenhithe, just east of London, and began their journey. Between them, they carried 134 men, a ship's cat, a dog named Neptune, a monkey named Jack, which was a gift from Lady Franklin, 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of liquor, around 12,000 books, theater costumes, sports gear, and one more brand new invention critical to the mission, which was 16,000 tin cans of food. These included fruit and vegetables to stave off scurvy and would for the first time comprise nearly all of an expedition's rations. The ship set sail up, stopping at Stromness in Scotland, and then across the Atlantic to Whalefish Islands on the west coast of Greenland, with 2 other ships accompanying them. The 2 ships would then top up the supplies of the Terror and Erebus before departing back to England and leaving the expedition on their own. While they were on the islands, 5 members of the expedition would also be discharged and sent home after falling ill during the Atlantic crossing. Before the expedition set off again, the crew spent a few days ashore, where they wrote their last letters home and enjoyed what relative warmth they could. In the letters, they said the officers had already begun their scientific work tracking the weather and other natural phenomena. Franklin had also reportedly banned swearing and drunkenness, but there were doubts about how effective that would be with the sailors. But overall, the crew was confident and excited. They were about to step off on the adventure of a lifetime and mark their names in the history books. The expedition set sail once again on the 12th of July, 1845, with 129 men aboard. 2 whaling ships met up with them in Baffin Bay, waiting for an opening in the ice before seeing them off into a large channel known as Lancaster Sound. This was the last time the Franklin expedition was ever seen alive. After entering the channel, they just vanished, and it would take over 150 years and dozens of expeditions and investigations to piece together what happened to them. These investigations are even still ongoing, but here is what we do know. Sailing was slow in the north. Even during the summer, most channels are packed with ice, and the ships need to push floating chunks of ice out of the way as they progressed. If this was done too quickly, this would gradually damage the ship's bows and potentially sink them. This would also show one of the first nails in the expedition's coffin, which had always been there, it just hadn't been realized yet. The steam engines carried by both ships, which powered their revolutionary brass propellers, could only produce 25 horsepower at 4 knots. This was only a tenth of the power of icebreakers less than half their size had at the time. This feature wasn't a mystery, however, as the Admiralty had only included 12 days worth of fuel for the steam engines, which would have been much better used for heat than propulsion. It's likely that these were seen as more of a psychological benefit to the crew and to the British public, and were only of very limited use. As a result, the expedition would only travel around 800 kilometers, navigating around Cornwallis Island, before circling back to Beechey Island by the first winter freeze. This put them only around 350 kilometers from Baffin Bay where they began, but all things considered, this was actually decent progress. Throughout the winter, both ships sheltered in a cove between Beechey Island and the much larger Devon Island to avoid the churning sheets of ice that piled on top of one another in the high wind. Once the Erebus and Terror were frozen in sea ice, the crew gathered snow high enough to pack against the sides of both ships as insulation. Up top, the sails were taken down and a massive canvas tent covered most of the vessel's deck space. This would have given the crew slightly more space to move around in without being fully exposed to the elements. Over the winter of 1845 and into 1846, 3 members of the crew were buried on Beechey Island. Pneumonia is believed to be the final cause of death, but also not the only cause. By then, the second nail in the expedition's coffin was slowly being revealed, and unfortunately, it was one they'd been eating and drinking for months. The 16,000 cans of food that they brought on the expedition with them had been a rush job from the lowest bidder. Improper lead soldering had left traces inside the cans described like trails of wax down a candle, and many of the cans weren't even properly cooked or fully sealed either. So not only was there lead, but rotten food, botulism, and mold in many of the cans. Hair and tissue samples taken in 1984 confirmed that the men buried on Beechey Island had substantial lead levels in their bodies. But incredibly, the levels found were still too much, even for just the canned food. Apparently, the water desalination equipment they brought with them should never have been used to supply drinking water because its lead piping could have easily corroded when exposed to sea salt. In addition to that, another theory to explain the unexpectedly high levels of lead in the bodies was a critical lack of zinc in the crew's diet. A lack of which over time causes the body to slowly begin cannibalizing its own bones, releasing even more lead into the bloodstream. So this combination of bad food, lead poisoning, and zinc deficiency made any disease the crew encountered that much worse, damaging their immune systems, causing brain fog, and slowly building up as the years went on. Even worse than that, the 5 men sent back home from Greenland before the ships even reached the Canadian archipelago had tuberculosis, meaning there was already tuberculosis on those ships. In any case, the next year, the ship sailed south towards what was then known as King William Land on the very edge of the known map. At the time, it was unclear if this was an island or not, and Franklin had to make a choice. If he sailed down the eastern side of King William Land, and it was an island, he might reach more southern waters faster, but if it wasn't, he'd have to backtrack some unknown distance. The second option was to set sail west around King William, since that was the direction they were trying to go anyways. Given that choice, it seemed less risky to sail west, and so that was the choice he made. But in doing so, Franklin accidentally brought the ships into one of the most dangerous places in the passage. The west side of King William Island is like a funnel, narrowing down and collecting ice flows from 2 channels before pinching them between itself and several smaller islands. The expedition had unknowingly sailed into some of the densest ice flows in the world, and was given no chance to correct their mistake before being locked on the 12th of September. They would then spend the winter of 1846 to 1847 on the ice once again. Back home in January of 1847, Lady Franklin got more and more concerned. Although it was expected that her husband would spend at least one winter on the ice, two just didn't sit right with her. First, she asked, and then she basically demanded that the Admiralty do something and prepare a rescue operation, but the Admiralty maintained their confidence that all was well. They did, at the very least, begin to plan a search if that became necessary. This didn't convince Lady Franklin, though, even slightly, and she went directly to the British public, calling in every favor she had to get the word out. This included a personal friend of hers, Charles Dickens, who used his standing as the most popular writer in England to champion her cause. Already, the crew of the expedition desperately needed rescue, but even they might not have realized it yet. With the improper sealing of many of their cans, there was another fatal side effect. The Royal Navy had used bottled lemon juice for generations to prevent scurvy, but the more modern practice was canned fruits, just as it was with the expedition. The problem was, with an improper seal or contamination, vitamin C is chemically unstable and will degrade over time. They likely didn't notice it during the first winter, or maybe even the second, but they had much less good fruit aboard than they thought they did. Then, in May of 1847, 8 members of the expedition would hike ashore with letters, crossing the ice to King William Island, and leave 2 copies of a report for future explorers to find. The letter stated where the ships were wintering with a set of coordinates. It also reported their previous stay at Beechey Island, the trip around Cornwallis Island, that Sir John Franklin was commanding, and finally it read, "All well." The handwriting is believed to be that of Captain Fitzjames, and the 2 officers who went ashore signed both messages. These messages were then placed in stone cairns to keep them safe, and there was no mention of anything wrong, but that was about to change. The crew had likely expected to leave soon, which is why they left messages in the first place, but that year, the Arctic hit record low summer temperatures. June, July, and into August, the ice never melted. The Erebus and the Terror and all of their crew remained stuck in the ice through the summer and then into fall. Modern ice core samples have even confirmed that 1845 to 1859 was the peak of an unusually cold 50-year period with less seasonal melting than any period in the previous 1,000 years. During this time, the Terror began to list heavily in the ice, and most of the crew moved to the Erebus to share heat and consolidate what decent rations they had left. The Terror was instead used as a cold storage for excess supplies and for the bodies as they began to mount. Then, on the 11th of June, 1847, Captain Sir John Franklin would join the dead. By then, the symptoms of scurvy and lead poisoning would both be apparent to the doctors and scientists aboard the ships, but there wasn't much they could do to stop them at this point. No notable plant life grows in the Canadian Arctic, and the wildlife could be just as dangerous. The crews did have hunting tools, spears, muskets, and other equipment with them, but the Arctic seals, polar bears, and fish all carry botulism type E. This is the only strain of botulism that can exist in such cold temperatures. The native Inuit had spent thousands of years building genetic resistance to it, but the same couldn't be said for Europeans. A single piece of meat improperly cooked, or the blood of a butchered animal getting on another piece of food could be a death sentence. Finally, in the winter of 1847 to 1848, with no sign of the expedition, the Admiralty agreed to act. Something was wrong, and they couldn't afford to ignore the year-long public outcry any longer. In early 1848, a search and rescue operation was sent from both the Pacific and Atlantic ends of the passage, as well as overland. One of the men to participate in the search was James Ross, who was one of the men who had passed up a chance to lead the expedition at the request of his wife. He then set sail on the HMS Enterprise to try and save the life of his close friend, Francis Crozier. At the same time, the Admiralty offered a £20,000 reward for anyone who assisted the expedition, or around $2.5 million today, and $10,000 for any information about what happened. In April of 1848, it must have been clear to the expedition that they had no choice. Their food was due to run out that summer, and even those estimates had assumed that the 16,000 cans would all be edible. Even with rationing, the end of their supplies was approaching, and with the seas frozen, they would have to walk. So on the 25th of April, they returned to King William Island and left another letter by writing in the margins of the first. It said that Sir John Franklin was dead, along with 9 officers and 15 crew in total. It also stated that the ships had been deserted on the 22nd, and 105 survivors under Crozier would attempt to walk 240 kilometers or 150 miles to Backsfish River, also known as Back River. Then once they were there, they would try to row to the nearest trading station. So after a year and 7 months of unending winter, the crew finally left, and by then, the situation was desperate. Many of them were unable to handle the physical strain due to being weak, sick, and malnourished from years and living in such horrible conditions. Over 20 bodies from the Erebus were found on the coast of King William Island at a series of camps where they had no choice but to leave the dying behind. It would have been bad enough if it was just a walk, but it wasn't. The closest trading post was still hundreds of kilometers upriver, so the men had to bring the ship's boats with them. These were massive rowing vessels, loaded with as many supplies as each could carry. Each one of these was roughly 3,600 kilograms or 8,000 pounds. Then, with the ice floes piling up against one another in the wind, freezing in uneven shapes, and King William Island being rough limestone gravel, putting the boats onto sledges was the only option. So as they were slowly starving, suffering internal bleeding from the onset of scurvy, and poisoned from years of lead exposure, it would have been day after day of agony to pull the boats they needed to live. At least some of them did. With the hindsight of 150 years, we know that the trek south wasn't a unified one. Groups and individuals broke off from the main party, either intentionally because of bad weather or from being abandoned. But those groups didn't give up either. In fact, bodies have been found in over a dozen different locations. Some took parallel or alternate routes south, while others, especially those who fell out of the march early on, even returned to the ships where food, fuel, and shelter still existed. That summer, in 1848, was when the food was expected to run out, had everything gone to plan. Even still, though, decades and centuries later, unopened cans would be found aboard the wrecks of both ships and at numerous landing sites. It seems at some point the crew must have realized the dangers of their own rations and chose to go without them. Then, sometime between July and August 1849, it's speculated that the Erebus was freed from the ice. This is because Inuit have claimed to have seen a three-masted ship off the coast of the Royal Geographical Society Islands and to have witnessed white men with guns and pikes hunting caribou near the Adelaide Peninsula. This story is also reinforced by the fact that the Inuit claimed that the group had a non-Inuit dog with them, which was presumably Neptune. This was a detail that the natives couldn't have otherwise known about. Whatever the case, a year later in 1850, another group of Inuit claimed to have found another abandoned ship stuck in the ice still. Climbing aboard, they found the ship's stove still burning and several of the bodies of crew members in their bunks still. At some point in the summer of that year, the main party splintered further and many of its members died in an area known as Starvation Cove. Smaller groups also continued down to Chantry Inlet along various coastlines and paths. One group of 4 was reportedly encountered by the Inuit, and weirdly, only one of the men was on the verge of starvation. It was later learned that he was the only one who had refused to engage in cannibalism. The Inuit then took them in to feed them and tend to them, and in that time, another member of the group died of disease before the remaining 3 were strong enough to continue. Later in August, a search party would come upon the first 3 graves on Beechey Island. This would have been the first concrete confirmation that something happened to the expedition, and these would have been some of the first to die early on before they traveled south. Following this discovery and concern about what might have happened to the rest of the crew, as well as Lady Franklin's continued public concerns, finding the crew drew more effort than even discovering the passage had. No less than 11 ships set sail in 1850 with more to come, several of which would have accidents of their own in the coming years. As a quick side note, one of these ships, the HMS Resolute, would be abandoned during the search and later recovered by an American whaling ship in the next thaw. The wood from it would then be used to make the Resolute desk and gifted to the US President, which has since been a permanent fixture in the Oval Office. Incredibly, another ship, the HMS Investigator under Captain Robert McClure, would actually find the legendary Northwest Passage while looking for Franklin. But then, after sailing in from the west side of the Arctic, this ship would also become trapped in ice and abandoned after 2 years. In 1853, after a rescue party marched out and met them, from the HMS Resolute, the 2 crews then combined their resources to make it to safety over the following year. All of this is to say that while it's easy to point at all the things wrong with the Franklin expedition, the place itself was just as much responsible. Those are just 2 of many examples of ships intended to rescue the expedition and later needing rescue themselves, in spite of being prepared for it and knowing that help would come much faster. Of the remaining Franklin crew, the most successful known group of survivors made it as far as Chesterfield Inlet on the western coast of Hudson Bay by using a lighter inflatable boat. But for all the progress they made, it just wasn't enough. Over the following decade, different Inuit groups claimed to have seen as many as 40 men traveling south in 1850, but by 1851, the group or groups had dropped to as little as 4 men, no longer pulling any boats. It's believed that by the end of 1851, most or all of the members of the crew had died of starvation or exposure. At the same time, during that era, the accounts of the Inuit weren't really believed, so the searchers didn't use much of the information that could have been available to them. Then, in 1854, a Scottish surgeon and explorer met several Inuit who gave him brass buttons and other items from the expedition as proof of their claims. They also claimed to have come across a grave with as many as 30 corpses and evidence of the men cutting, cooking, and cannibalizing their fellow crewmates. These claims were again quickly rejected by the Victorian public, the families of the crew, and quite vocally by Charles Dickens, who went on to write 3 stories discrediting this idea. This left the Inuit testimony by the wayside for well over 100 years until only recently academic sources began to compare and corroborate their accounts. In spite of the disbelief at the time, many of the Inuit stories are consistent in their major details, even if the timing isn't always right or the translation wasn't flawless. For instance, one group claims to have seen Captain Crozier and one other man as late as 1852 to 1858. This doesn't necessarily mean the account was incorrect, but rather that the timekeeping was off or mistranslated somehow. For the main search party, though, it wouldn't be all the way until 1858 that a first-hand account would finally be found, when another expedition funded by Lady Franklin herself came upon the cairn containing the two final reports from the Erebus and Terror. Only then, at least 8 years after the last of the crew had most likely died, did they finally have hard evidence to go on. 10 years after that, in 1869, another explorer met a group of Inuit on his second of 3 expeditions. They claimed to have met Franklin's men as well and offered them what food they could, but there were just too many to save. To feed their own families, the Inuit were forced to leave the men to their fates, which also didn't do anything to help the British public's opinion of the Inuit. Finally, in 1993, 145 years after the search began, the expedition's final camp was located and every detail of cannibalism the Inuit had spoken of was confirmed. Cut marks on the bones showed attempts to remove the hands, feet, and heads, and the crew had even attempted to drill into the largest bones to extract the marrow inside. Today, we still don't know what happened to the majority of the men. Even with that final camp, only a fraction have been found, and many probably never will be. However, we might soon get a better idea of what happened at least, because in 2014, the wreck of the Erebus was found in Crampton Bay, remarkably preserved. It was also right where the Inuit said it would be off the Adelaide Peninsula, lending more credence to the story of some of the crew hunting with them and the sightings of the dog Neptune. Then, even more incredibly, 2 years later, the Terror would be found in, ironically enough, Terror Bay. This bay had even been given the name in the ship's honor without any idea that the ship was actually there. With both ships found, archaeological expeditions had been planned for the year 2020, but obviously those were interrupted. So finally, in May of 2022, limited work resumed. This means that there might be significant updates to this story over the next few years, and the true last moments of the Franklin expedition. Hello everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. I have some exciting news. In the near future, we're going to be starting a Scary Interesting podcast. This will feature brand new Scary Interesting content, similar to what you see here on YouTube, but in an audio-only format.
All right, y'all. That was really good too. Both of his shows were fantastic. I liked them both. Gosh, there was a lot of crap going on that voyage, and we never found out what happened to Jack, the poor monkey. They never said, did they? Sad day. Did Malloy fall asleep? He said he was having the after party. Hold on, let me check Discord real quick. Oh no, see, look, he's right there. He's right there. So, just so everybody knows, we're heading over to Mr. Malloy's for the little after party hangout. So make sure you head over there. I'm going to drop Scary Interesting's link one more time, and then I'm sure Maddie or Misfit will drop Mr. Malloy's link or his channel link. That way, if y'all want to come hang out, I will be over there as well. And Fofa Cat, I'm talking like my typo, so please excuse me. Fofa Cat. I hope I said that right. This was your first time here, so normally you'll see me during the week do tarot card readings. However, we still have so much fun, so I encourage you to come hang out. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry, I can't say nothing. Right? I can't do nothing. Words are hard and numbers are harder. All right, so there you go. There is the link. I will see everybody over there. And if you didn't, please make sure you do hit the like button on this video before I end. And I'll see y'all over there at Mr. Malloy's in just a few short minutes or seconds, however long it takes to get the stream up and running. But I will be over there. I said it right? Okay, good. Thank you. All right, y'all. See you over there.